All right, let's get right into it. We see those clouds of vapor everywhere, but what's actually going on inside an e-cigarette on a chemical level? We're going to break down the science step by step, from a single simple ingredient to the complex chemical reaction it creates, all to answer one question: what's really in the vapor?
It seems like a simple question, right? But the answer is way more complex than you might think. That cloud you see, it's not just harmless water vapor. It's the end result of a really intense chemical transformation happening in a split second. So what are we actually looking at?
To understand what comes out, we have to know what goes in. So let's start at the very beginning, with the main ingredient that makes up the vast majority of what's in an e-liquid.
Here it is, propylene glycol, or PG for short. Now, this is a super common chemical. You find it all over the place, in food, makeup, even in some medicines. On its own, in its pure form, it's generally considered safe for us to consume. But, and this is a huge but, not all PG is the same.
This is absolutely critical to understand. The PG in e-liquids is USP grade. That means it's ultra pure, meeting the very strict standards set for things that go into our bodies like medicine. This is completely different from the lower purity industrial grade stuff used in things like antifreeze or car coolants. This distinction is key because this is where that whole vaping is antifreeze myth comes from. It's misleading. The purity standard is what separates a food additive from an industrial chemical.
So now we get to the real heart of the matter. What happens when you take this very pure, very stable chemical and subject it to the insane heat of an e-cigarette coil?
Well, the process is called pyrolysis. And let's be clear, this is not burning. There's no flame. Think of it more like the heat is so intense it just rips the PG molecule apart, and then the pieces snap back together in totally new ways. Let's walk through exactly how that happens.
Okay, so it all kicks off with something called dehydration. As you can see right here in this diagram from the research, the intense heat basically acts like a chemical crowbar. It pries a water molecule right out of the stable PG structure, and that one little action starts a massive chain reaction. With that water molecule gone, the whole structure becomes incredibly unstable. It's like a chemical domino that just got tipped over. It's immediately going to crash into the next step of the reaction, reforming into something else.
And here's the result. That unstable molecule completely rearranges itself and the atoms snap back together to form entirely new substances, mainly things like propanol and acetone. But the science shows this reaction is messy. It doesn't just create one or two neat new things, it creates a whole chemical soup.
And this idea of a chemical soup is where the story gets a lot more complicated. That pyrolysis reaction creates a whole cocktail of unintended byproducts that were never supposed to be there.
The research identifies a whole group of these byproducts called carbonyls, and you'll probably recognize a few names on this list, and probably not for good reasons. Let's take a closer look at the heavy hitters here.
Let's start with the most infamous one, formaldehyde. The National Toxicology Program doesn't classify this as a possible or probable risk. No, it is a known human carcinogen. Its presence isn't an additive, it's a direct result of that intense heat breaking down the PG.
Next on the list is acetaldehyde. The EPA classifies this one as a probable human carcinogen, which means there's very strong evidence it can cause cancer. Again, this isn't an ingredient in the e-liquid. It's created by the heating process.
And then there's propanol, one of the main things created that we saw earlier. While it's not considered a carcinogen, studies have linked it to serious respiratory problems, including fluid buildup in the lungs. So, right away we're seeing a mix of known carcinogens and other lung irritants. Okay, so we know these harmful chemicals are present. That's a fact. But the next and maybe most important question is, how much of them are there? To really understand the risk, you need context. And the gold standard for context in this world is, of course, traditional cigarette smoke.
And the data from one of the key scientific studies gives us this incredibly powerful number. When scientists measured the levels of the 9 most harmful toxicants listed by the World Health Organization, they found an average reduction of 99% in e-cigarette vapor compared to smoke from a standard cigarette. 99%.
And what's really amazing is how consistent this is. This wasn't some lucky one-off result. You can see here, they tested 3 different product variations, and the reduction was always over 98%. That 99% average holds up. The levels of these chemicals are just in a completely different universe.
And just to really drive that point home, think about this.
Decades of research have identified over 6,500 different chemical compounds in cigarette smoke. It is an unbelievably complex and dense mixture of toxins compared to what's produced when you just heat up PG.
Now, trying to measure these tiny, tiny amounts of chemicals in e-cigarette vapor actually creates a really interesting scientific challenge. When you're hunting for just a few molecules of something, how do you know you're not just measuring the background noise of the lab?
While scientists use a clever control called an air/method blank, or AMB. Before they even test the actual vapor, they run a test on the clean air in the lab using the exact same equipment and process. This gives them a baseline measurement of any trace contaminants that are just already there.
And this is absolutely essential. Why? Because the toxicant levels in vapor are so low, they can literally be in the same ballpark as the background levels in the lab. If you didn't subtract that baseline, you could easily end up over-reporting the amount of formaldehyde, for example, blaming the vapor for contaminants that were just floating in the air all along.
Okay, so we've gone from a pure chemical to a fiery reaction, we've identified the harmful byproducts, and we've put their levels into the proper context. So let's pull all of this together. What is the scientific bottom line?
It's really a four-step story. 1. You start with a very pure ingredient. 2. The intense heat of pyrolysis breaks it down and rebuilds it. 3. That process creates known harmful chemicals like formaldehyde. But, and this is the absolute key, 4. The concentration of those chemicals is, on average, 99% lower than what you'd find in cigarette smoke.
And all this leaves us with a really challenging final question. The science is clear. E-cigarette vapor is not harmless. It contains carcinogens, but it is also without a doubt significantly less complex and profoundly less toxic than cigarette smoke. So the real question isn't whether it's safe. It isn't. The real question is, how should this deep understanding of relative risk shape our entire conversation about public health?